Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about ambiguous grief. You may be wondering why it's so dark. It's because it's not even 7 a.m. Uncle Tim has to go downtown today, so I have to film this before sunrise. But you're probably wondering why I'm talking about ambiguous grief, because it's something that has to do with games. I finally found the psychological term that explains why I dislike certain features in role playing games, but I will get there. First, I better explain what I'm talking about. So, you probably know what regular grief is. Regular grief is when you lose something that you had. So, grief is what you feel when a loved one passes away, or you have a breakup, or you realize you're losing touch with a friend of yours and you guys just aren't as good friends anymore, or anything that involves that you had something and now you realize you don't have it anymore. That's grief. But ambiguous grief, which is sometimes I think called ambiguous loss, but I like the term ambiguous grief better. Ambiguous grief happens when you come to the realization that you will never have something that you always wanted. Or worse, something that you expected to have. So maybe for you, it's hard to say what it would be for you. Maybe you thought you'd own a house by the time you were 35, or maybe you thought you'd get a college degree, or maybe you thought you'd get a game industry job, and you're coming to the realization that that isn't going to happen for you. Now, some of these things aren't ambiguous grief because they could happen. They could still happen. I'm talking about things, though, that you finally come to terms with, like, I'm not going to be an astronaut. I'm not going to be president of the United States. And if that's something you really wanted, that's ambiguous grief. Like for me, because I'm retiring, I know that means I'm never going to make a big multi-$100 million game. That's just not going to happen. When I first went to the GDC in '94, the Game Developers Conference, I went to the big banquet at the end and I saw people getting Game Developer Awards. And those were awards that were given by their peers. And you have to remember, this is when I was in the middle of reading all the Hugo Award winners. And I said I like Hugo Awards better than Nebula Awards, because Hugo Awards were given by the fans and peers to science fiction writers, where the Nebula Awards were kind of given by press and editors. So for me, the GDC Award was that kind of award. It was people in my industry saying, we played your game, we think it's amazing. Never got a GDC Award. I am realizing, I'm never going to work on Fallout again. That's a form of ambiguous grief. Now, I came to terms with that. I thought I did decades ago. But now I'm really realizing, okay, even if all the cards came together, I'm backing out of the industry. So someone else will have to make that. But, okay, if that's ambiguous grief in your life or my life, why am I talking about it on this channel? Well, the biggest thing that annoys me in games, and I've mentioned this on a few other videos, is when you make a character in a game, and it's a perfectly legal character, you made it in the character editor, you're playing along, you're leveling up, you're progressing a certain way, and then you come to a point in the main story that you can't do it. And it doesn't matter how much you level up, it doesn't matter how good you make the character from now on, this character can't finish the game. I've played some RPGs like that, and there's nothing more annoying. But there's also this sense of grief. You're like, I love this character. This is the character I wanted to be. This is the character I wanted to see how the story would play out. But you came to something in the main story arc that just can't be done. Ambiguous grief can happen in more ways than just that. But to me, that's one of the biggest ones, which is why I always told designers on my game, you have to make sure that the main story arc can be played through with any kind of character I can make. It's why I played Outer Worlds, 16 times, 19 times? I would make wildly different characters. I would put all the points in one particular school of skills. I'd buy a particular set of perks just to see if the game would let me finish. But there's other things that can happen in a game that can trigger ambiguous grief. You may make a character and then realize, I'm never going to be able to get this perk. That would happen in Fallout if you didn't make a character with certain attributes, certain special attributes. you may realize, oh shoot, there's a perk that requires that attribute, and there's no way to raise it. You may realize that you just hit the level cap, and you're not going to buy any more perks. They're no more available to you. You cannot get the perk you were building towards. But in other games, I've seen that happen with items. Like I really wanted an item, only to find out that it was restricted to a particular character class. Or you had to do a quest line, and there's no way my character could do that quest line, either because he was on the wrong faction, or he was the wrong character race, or some faction that I'd pissed off was the only one that offered it, or I killed somebody who was inadvertently involved in the quest. So now I'm never going to get that item. And there's other ones too, like you may discover you made a choice that made a faction unhappy, and that was not your intention. And now there's nothing you can do to make them happy because the designer decided once they had reached a certain level of unhappiness, they stopped offering you quests. So now there's nothing you can do. You just kind of have to live with the fact that that's what the game is going to be like from then on. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, I thought you were the big choice and consequence guy. And I am. But I think ambiguous grief should be avoidable. And sometimes it is unavoidable, because if you're playing a game with character classes and someone tries to play against class, like if you take a wizard and you're like, I'm going to put him in the front line and he's going to attack everybody with a melee weapon, which for the wizard would probably be a dagger, you're going to have a bad game. And maybe you can finish, but that's an example of you're playing a character that's just a class that wasn't designed to be played that way. Especially like take a character with low charisma and then say, I'm going to be the speech guy. That's just, it's not going to work, and you're going to be unhappy. But I feel like that was telegraphed, that if you were paying attention, you would know. What I'm talking about with ambiguous grief in games is things that aren't being telegraphed. Events that happen in the game and you don't know that that's what's going to happen. We did that in Fallout, and it bugged me. It bugged me that people were surprised at some of the end slides. That the end slides would come up and they're like, I didn't know that picking this one faction in Junktown would have this result. There was nothing that telegraphed it. I didn't know that asking the water merchants to deliver water to my vault would cause a mutant raid to happen there. Now, some people may go, well, you can kind of think about it. It's a logical result. But what I prefer instead is for designers to think about their designs and telegraph the results to the player. Basically make it possible for the player to discover what the results of their actions are going to be before they make those actions. Now, I don't mean that there's somebody who says, do you want to pick A or B? If you pick A, this will happen. If you pick B, this will happen. It doesn't need to be that literal and superficial. It could be more like the player's told they're going to be making a choice and they can research it. And maybe they're in a library and they find out something about the monster they're going to kill. You know, that maybe it only attacks when it's, babies are threatened. And then you discover, the town that is paying me money to kill that dragon has been stealing its dragon eggs and selling them on the open market. Or you discover that this one person who wants you to go assassinate someone else that they said had done something wrong to them. The reason that other person did that wrong thing is because the one who's paying you had done something even worse years before. So at that point, I don't mind making the consequence, the whole thing gray. In fact, I like gray choices. It's like sometimes you have to pick, instead of picking the best good option, you have to pick the least bad option. But I think the player should know before they pick what's going on and what will happen when they proceed. Because it's sort of like saying the worst thing you should happen. We used to say when you're giving someone their annual review at work, the last thing they should ever be is surprised. That's not, the annual review isn't the time for you to bring up, you're getting your work done way slower than all of your peers. That's not the time to be talking about that. You should have been mentioning that months before. Similarly, in a game, the game shouldn't go, you killed this guy, now you will never ever be able to join this faction, you will never be able to get this item. what should happen before you ever meet that person, you should know that they're in charge of this faction. So killing that person will really make the faction upset. And then if you continue to dig, you can find out, oh, there's this rare artifact, but only faction knows where it is. So you don't have to actually expressly tell them. But the player who's paying attention will go, ooh, I really want that artifact. That faction is the only one that knows where it is, and she's in charge of the faction. Maybe I shouldn't kill her. So that's what I kind of would always tell my designers later on. It's like your results don't have to be stated, but if the player digs for them, especially in dialogue, some players hate dialogue. That's why we always let you have an early out. But I want to make it so that if you had kept talking to this person, they might have told you something important, something that would telegraph the consequence of your actions. That's the point of all this. If you're making your game and you want it to have consequences, at least let players who are paying attention understand what the consequences are for their actions. And I think it's true that if you pay attention, you can usually figure out the consequences for your actions. And that's true in games and in life. So, that's my talk on ambiguous grief.